All right, so thank you everyone for attending this Knowledge Bite session on a very, very snowy day here in Southern Vermont. This is the 13th session. We started back in July, and we've had lots of different topics that we've covered. Today is Brownfield Assistance Programs. We have Susan McMahon from Windham Regional Commission. We have Jim Henderson from the Bennington County Regional Commission. And we have Brett Long from the State Agency of Commerce and Community Development. So the goal of these webinar sessions are to provide high-level information on economic and workforce development resources, Brownfield assistance programs being one of those. At the end, you'll have contact information for the right people to talk to if you want to dive more in depth. So the structure of these webinars is it's a 20-minute presentation. There'll be 10 minutes for question and answer. I have all the attendees muted, like I said, so if you have any questions either during or after the presentation, go ahead and type them into the chat function, and we'll be sure to get to it. These are being recorded, and they're archived at that website you see here. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. So let me just switch presenters so that Susan can have the reins. And we'll go from there.
Can you see it all now?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, let me just get it. I do a slideshow.
I don't see anything, Susan.
Is there anyone else who can't see?
I can see it, Susan, but it might just take a minute to load.
Yep, there it goes.
All right, Susan, you're good.
So good afternoon. My name is Susan McMahon. I am the Associate Director at Windham Regional Commission. We've had a Brownfields program since 2000, and we have both assessment and cleanup funds, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm giving kind of an overview of Brownfield and a little bit about my program. After I speak, Jim Henderson from Bennington County Regional Commission will speak about his program, and then Brett Long from the state will talk about the state's revolving loan fund for Brownfield's cleanup. So let's get going. Just so everyone knows that Brownfields are land and buildings whose expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And that's an important thing. This is the definition by EPA, and often you find sites that the potential presence, and then when you go in to look at it, you find out there's nothing there. Brownfields are not Superfunds. They're sites that may have a little bit of contaminant that allows you to reuse them. So, and we can get more into that later if there's questions. One of the things, especially in southern Vermont, but probably throughout all of Vermont, our rivers and streams provided a lot of power, and that's where you find an awful lot of our brownfields in our regions, I should say that. Just to give you a sense, I'm sure Jim can do a map just like this, but if you see all the red dots on this map, it shows where the commercial properties are, and notice how they're right up against our streams. Just a quick thing just to get a sense of the different types of brownfields. ST Oregon is well known in at least southeastern Vermont, and we also had other things such as print shops, foundries, paper manufacturers, and we even had a cigar factory. Particularly in our villages, you're going to find stuff as well. We also have, small mom and pop gas stations that there's really no memory of their use, but they're there, and you can see by looking into this one in Wilmington, as well as if you see the yellow in the screen. That's one in Londonderry that I'm sure no one knows. So our funding can be used for both petroleum and hazardous assessment work. So it sometimes can be a challenge of reusing sites in the village and downtown. And for regional planning commissions and the state of Vermont land use laws, they really want to promote redevelopment in villages and downtowns surrounded by rural countryside. So that's really what brought us to get this funding, to make it easier to develop where we would like to encourage redevelopment. And so also developers often shy away from sites with even the potential hint of contamination. Just a sense, I don't need to read this off to you, but these are just all the different types of sites that you can think of. And there's others as well. We have over 55 sites that we've worked on, so I could probably add a couple more there. So what's involved in bringing this back to reuse? We only really want to work with sites that have kind of a reuse plan in place. So often there's some redevelopment planning and then corrective action planning if you find contamination, and cleanup, again, if you find contamination. So I'm just going to briefly go through the steps and show you different, just the cost and what's involved. So here's an example of a flooded site in Londonderry, which was called Gasoline Alley, and we did some redevelopment planning under some other funding, but we can do limited redevelopment planning with our funds as well. And a phase one, which is where you start, and it's important to do that, and it's important that it's involved what they call all-appropriate inquiry. We won't get much time to get into the meanings of that, but just know that it's important that it has in that. And so it basically, there's no testing going on. It's just basically looking at what has happened before, document search, site visits, interviews, historical records, and just finding out if they're what they call recognized environmental conditions. Now, that could be found by walking around and you see staining on the floor. That could also be looking at the historical records and you find out that a site was used for a photography lab. So that is what a phase one is. Sometimes that's all you need. This is an example in Guilford of the general store. It was a petroleum, it had gas tank store. If they were moved properly, found out when they're doing the research, we're good to go, and a nonprofit is running that store. Have phase two testing if the historical. Can one hold on one moment? A dog just ran in. I'll be right back. Sorry. Sorry about that. I'm working out of the house today. So this is a phase two. Is when the phase one says that it needs to have testing. You work with the state of Vermont, and this is when we start, doing test wells, water quality, air quality, a whole bunch of things. And you will find out then, whether or not you have contamination or not. But sometimes that's all you need. Here is 118 Elliott Street. We had to do a little bit more testing than we normally do, but once they were good to go, and they were actually were able to get a certificate of completion from the state. But sometimes you do need a corrective action plan. Shown here is probably one of my more contaminated sites that we slowly have been New England Youth Theater, and that can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000. And then it gives you the cleanup alternatives. I've had cleanup as little as $10,000 or as much as $1.3 million. So it really, really is site dependent and depending on what you find. Hopefully, the Brownfields assistance programs, I believe every regional commission now has Brownfields or has it in the past. In particular, in Southern Vermont, Windham Regional Commission and Bennington County Regional Commission, and the town of Brattleboro currently has a site-specific program. So if you need assistance for Brownfield assessment, I would start with your Regional Planning Commission. We have the funding. We can work with both private and public entities. So I would start there, and there's some contact information for both Jim and I. The state also has limited money, but tends to use that money in areas of the state where they don't have assessment funds. So start with your regional commission first. There's also cleanup assistance, and Brett will talk about the Brownfields Revitalization Fund, and the Windham Regional Commission also has a cleanup fund, and Brett will talk, but they can get both grants and loans, grants to nonprofits and municipalities, and loans to private nonprofits and municipalities. There's also 2 other revolving loan funds in the state, but start with, if you have one that has one, start there first, but also call the state first, and then if we need to, we'll contact the other regional commissions that have a program. Just a quick examples of some program examples. See, we even had we're partially done with a cleanup at the New England Youth Theater. Brattleboro Farmers Market wasn't an inexpensive cleanup. We gave them a grant, and now they have a parking lot that helps with their farmers market. Red Clover Common in Brattleboro, right near the high school. Now we have Red Clover Common, and that was a little bit more expensive, but we've got the site redeveloped and about 45 units of housing. Algiers Village in Guilford, and now again affordable housing. Not everything's affordable housing, there's just some that moved along quickly, and it even won a national award. Wilmington, Vermont, this is the Bar Board Factory, and is the intermodal facility. We helped them with a loan and a grant. I apologize, my son was supposed to keep the dogs outside. And Main Street Arts, and this is in Saxon's River. We helped them with a grant, and this is what you have going on now. And I am Susan McMahon. Here is my contact information, and I'm going to use this for Jim Henderson to talk about the Brownfields program, and I'm going to go let my dogs out. So go away, Jim, and I'll move this for you.
Thank you, Susan. The Bennington County Regional Commission started their Brownfield redevelopment program in 2006. We've had 3 grants. That our last grant was in 2010. And with that last grant, we had $200,000 of hazardous substance assessments, and $156,000 was targeted toward petroleum. We accomplished quite a bit with that last grant. 4 Phase 1 environmental assessments, 5 Phase 2s. The 5 Phase 2s led to 5 corrective action plans. And we had some money left over. We're running out of time, so we redirected our petroleum fund to working on the downtown Bennington area-wide plan, which set into motion our Putnam Block redevelopment scenario, which Bill Colvin is heading up. Next slide, please. So in 2017, we got another grant. And we're ready to start working on getting some brownfield sites in the pipeline. We got $200,000 hazardous substance assessments and $100,000 for petroleum. We're in the process of currently recruiting sites. We had our first steering committee meeting on Thursday, where we selected 3 environmental professional consultant firms to work with. We hope to accomplish up to 5 Phase 1 environmental assessments, and we hope to do at least 4 Phase 2 environmental assessments, which will lead to some corrective action plans. Part of our application for the 2017 assessment grant was that we prioritized and intend to focus our efforts in the downtown area-wide planning area. That doesn't mean that we would not work outside of that area. We will work with any town within our region. But we did want to focus on the downtown area, where we have a number of brownfield sites within a baseball throw of each other. Next slide, please. This is a map of our Bennington area-wide brownfield plan. It focuses on the main four corners of Bennington, the gateway of Bennington coming into from the west on Route 9. The large red area, which is red because it's commercial, just south of Main Street, bordering Main Street, that would be the Putnam block, where we are in the midst of a rather large redevelopment plan. Next slide, please. This is my contact. Please call me if you know of any sites in your town or a site that you may be interested in inquiring, and we'd love to enter a new site into our program. Thank you.
Hi, this is Brett Long. I am the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development for the state of Vermont. I'm going to talk a little bit about our program. We are only focused on cleanup. So once you've worked through the assessment process that Susan talked about, and generally speaking, people will already have a corrective action plan put together, please feel free to reach out to us and talk to us about cleaning up the site. The first bullet here talks about the fact that we receive the vast majority of our funding from the US EPA, and we essentially manage the program on their behalf. As I say, the funds are available for cleaning up brownfields rather than assessment. And again, as Susan kind of alluded to, we're really focused on ensuring that we're going to be providing funds that are going to enable the redevelopment of previously contaminated sites. Next slide. We're able to make grants of these funds to nonprofits, including municipalities. And in the situation where we're talking to a private entity, we're able to provide long-term, low-interest loans to those organizations. We can award up to $200,000 per parcel, which is significant because larger brownfields are often multiple parcels, so we potentially could do larger amounts than the $200,000. Next slide. In order to qualify for our program, a property must be enrolled in the state's WRBRI program. And I should say that we work very closely with our Agency of Natural Resources in the Department of Environmental Conservation, who are essentially our environmental specialists in monitoring the work that's being done. So the property must be enrolled in WRBRI, and WRBRI requires that a Phase 1 assessment has been done prior to the property having been purchased by its current owner, and it also requires that the current owner not have contributed to the contamination. And we're only able to fund the costs that are actually related to cleaning up the site as described in a corrective action plan. Next slide. We generate a lot of opportunities by trying to create a network of people. So, depending on what capacity you have out there on the phone, I encourage you to reach out to us or to reach out to one of these organizations. We're always looking for new potential sites to finance. Next slide. A couple of example projects. We actually just made our first couple of fundings on a project we refer to as a Richmond Creamery project. It's a former creamery and dairy and cheese-making facility in Richmond. Old-time property, lots of additions, lots of different buildings, riddled with asbestos, oil tanks, and some other surface contamination. It's been a long, hard road, but the project's now underway and is going to wind up being redeveloped, probably into a combination of a mixed-use building and a commercial building. It's a very interesting project for us because it is in a downtown district, literally across the street from restaurants, coffee shops, etc. Next slide. Another real interesting project is one where we financed the conversion of a former mobile home park into affordable housing using Vermont's net zero manufactured units. It has wound up being a terrific success, 14 units, and as a mobile home park, it was, I think, universally acknowledged to be an eyesore. And the property had been riddled with a combination of petroleum contaminants from everything from people working on their cars to leaking oil tanks. Next slide. And here in the Department of Economic Development, you can either reach out to me or to Christy Farnham, who works with me in managing the program. Thanks.
Great, thank you guys. Since it looks like Tim, you're the only one on the line at the moment, so you have the floor if you have any questions for Susan, Jim, and or Brett. I'll ask a question just to give him some time if he has any. In the experiences that the three of you have had in the past, it's always interesting to me about sort of hearing about the worst case scenario that you've experienced. You know, some site was, you know, way more contaminated than you ever thought it could be, and you know, what was sort of the success that came out of that. Susan, if you have any with this, can go on.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So the worst site that we had was, unfortunately, the New England Youth Theater. It was an example early on in our program that was purchased with the nonprofit not quite understanding the extent of the contamination. And once they tried to redevelop 3 parcels, and they brought in a private arts group to redevelop which was riddled with PCB because they used it was Tri-State Automotive. They used PCB in the paint. We found out it was going to cost $1.3 million to redevelop that site. Unfortunately, the prospective purchasers backed away. But what we were able to do is say, okay, you've got 3 parcels. Let's try to figure this out and work our way through. So we have done some of the PCB cleanup on that parcel early on when they did some work around the front of the theater. And now this summer they're going to do an outdoor auditorium and theater space. So they've been, what's the best way to handle a site of that magnitude was just to break it into easy pieces. And I just find working with arts organizations, they're also very interested in place. So they weren't going to run away from this site. They were just going to figure it out, and they were great to work with.
Great, thank you. Jim, what about you?
I'd like to tell a tale about timing and how a corrective action plan can lead to redevelopment in a very timely way when things line up right. We had just completed a Phase 1, Phase 2, and a corrective action plan on a property in downtown Bennington that was known as the Alcaro Motors building. It had been abandoned for about 10 years, and there was a mortgage holder just sitting on the property. Once the corrective action plan was finished, the mortgage holder realized that the cost would probably be more than what the property was worth at the time. On my ride down to work one day, shortly after we finished the corrective action plan, I saw a rather huge plume of black smoke rising out of Bennington, and that was the La Flamme furniture store burning to the ground. Several days later, Christopher La Flamme called me, and he said, I understand you know about everything there's to know about the former Alcaro building. Can I meet with you? And so I met with him. I gave him the corrective action plan. We started to talk to the town about what they could do. The town ended up taking the property in lieu of taxes from the landowner, and the landowner slept really well that night. And then the town then sold the property to Christopher LaFlamme for a very modest price, with the agreement that he would implement the corrective action plan, which he did through loans provided through the state of Vermont. Prior to him acquiring the property, he enrolled in the WRBRI program so that he is now protected through future releases. His liability is protected. About 6 months later, they finished their redevelopment and they have opened their furniture store. This is now their flagship store. And the parking lot that was on the other side of the street has now been redeveloped as a Dollar General. It's just one of my successes, and I'm proud of it. It just means that timing can be everything when you have the right information.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jim. And Brett, do you got any stories for us?
Yeah, the most difficult, we certainly have lots of big, dramatic brownfields, but the biggest, I guess the cautionary tale that I'd like to relate is the number of situations we get where somebody comes to us and has discovered their property is a brownfield, but they didn't take the time or spend the money to do the phase 1 assessment prior to purchasing the property, and therefore don't qualify for WRBRI. There are some things we can do sometimes to resolve that problem. It winds up meaning a transfer of the property. It's very time-consuming and expensive. So I would definitely encourage anybody to try to ensure that when they take possession of a property or they're talking to somebody about taking possession of a property, to do the phase 1 in advance and therefore not preclude themselves from being eligible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for participating in this. We have our next up Knowledge Bite is on January 9th, and we'll be hearing about the Town Officers Education Conference. And then the one after that, January 23rd, will be on resources that are provided by the Consumer Assistance Program. Again, if there's any suggestions on programs or resources that you are interested in learning about, that's my contact information. If you want to share this with somebody who missed it, it will be posted on the webpage, the Knowledge Bites webpage. And I hope everyone has a great holiday. Thank you guys for joining.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.